I'd like to introduce Harry Flotemersch from Shane and LLC that's going to be giving us a great presentation tonight on innovation. And Harry gave us a webinar earlier about a year ago, and this is kind of the continuation. Kind of think of this as part 2 of the webinar. So Harry, thank you for doing this. I know it's a lot of time out of your schedule to do this and prepare the presentation. So thank you, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce Harry. And Harry, have a great webinar. I'm going to make you a presenter.
Yeah, that's what we got to do. Am I there now?
Yep, just made you a presenter.
Hold on, not
yep,
yet.
Can see your page.
All right.
Excellent, thanks.
Oh, I got it. Okay. Thank you very much, Walt. I'm going to go right into it because let you know what I've been experiencing. Here we go. Let me get it to advance. Okay, first I want to just say hello and thank you for tuning in. If you're seeing a picture of the world map, then you've got the right screen. If you're having trouble making it on full screen, please email the host, Walt, and he will give you some instructions, if possible, to how to fix it, but it's not the trouble on our end. If you're having trouble with sound, I can't fix anything there. If I am talking too fast, feel free to tell Walt, and he'll let me know. I know some of you this is your second language. And I want to let you know a little bit about Shannon. We are a global company, and I'm a senior consultant for Shannon. We use REDX methodologies to efficiently improve product performance, product reliability, and process performance for launched products. We also leverage all this experience with our resilient design and development services, and that helps us reduce concept development iterations in new products and processes for our clients worldwide. And that service is one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. So, okay, let's get started with the webinar. First of all, if you tuned in November 2012, that's when I spoke last, and I was introducing the idea that there's a structured way to invent things or innovate or create concepts, and I was comparing that to finding root cause structured problem solving. And we're only going to talk about the shift into one of those quadrants today as a continuation, and it's important, what I've got circled here, that you can recognize as a problem solver when you need to shift into a complex structured method of approach and shift maybe back sometimes when it's low complexity when you can handle it with an unstructured approach. We're going to be only talking today about that shift, but I want to emphasize whatever kind of master or a practitioner or specialist you are, the most important thing is to know when to make a shift so that you can use the right tool for the right time. So this is our focus, structured concept development, and I want to let you know a little bit about the webinar. We're going to go through and first just give you some pointers on when it makes sense to use this methodology and when it doesn't. And that's an important skill to have, is when not to do something. And then I'm going to go a little bit of the overview of the process that I'm going to exemplify. And then the meat of the webinar is to walk through a real workshop. And it's going to be pretty messy, but I've got it kind of organized with the photographs of the real work that the people did in it. And I'm going to challenge you to try some of the things you saw tonight on real concept development challenges that you have, and actually give you some examples of some ones that I've worked on or I know about that you might look at and see some real ones. Then we'll have some question and answer and some discussion. So let's move on. First of all, when to do this type of activity. If you've already got a design you like and it meets the requirements and you don't really have any resources to work on any further and perhaps not really interested in working in a structured way, then this is not time to pull out this methodology. And as a facilitator, you've got to recognize when it's just really the not environment or context for it. But however, if you're talking to some group of people and they have some kind of concept they're putting together and they really are not ready to launch it or make prototypes and there's something bothering them or you're not sure they've been thorough, then that's maybe when you need to have this dialogue. And if you've been waiting for the things to become right just by chance or random insight, and you can't wait any longer for a miracle, it's time to get structured about it. So if you need to have some insights to handle the complexity, or need a way to manage some conversations where the people in the room need to be there, but they can't seem to get past some things, and you need some help getting that done, or maybe you even have some new requirements and conflicts that you already know you need to work on, that's when this is the right tool in my opinion. So let's go ahead further. This is the process I'm going to lay out. Is we're going to spend a lot of time in step 1 really making sure we understand the requirements, the constraints, and the resources. And this may irritate some of you because we're not just going to jump to thinking of answers. We're going to really want to make sure we understand the target. And this is how we reduce iterations. Step 2 is we're going to start talking with people and have them show what's come to their mind and start to combine them in a way that's collaborative so we can get collaboration going, not competition. And then step 3 is where we do some refinement and convergence, and it's another collaborative dialogue. And then step 4 is where we're going to actually say, okay, here's one of those concepts that we're going to try out and see how well we hit the target. So the way this 4-step process works is to get people through the background, observing things, have ideas, and merge them collaboratively, and have challenges that we see that aren't working and actually work on little specific detailed problems together, work them out as a team. And it's important for that team to be a diverse team so that different people might contribute at different times in the collaborative effort. And then we've converged down on some leading concepts. What we find is people are more willing to move forward when they've covered the concerns they have and they know that the things that need to be compromised or thought about, or they just know why we're doing things a certain way. And the benefits is more understanding earlier leads to less rework later. And reworking prototypes, rerunning tests, and having failed launches is no longer something that can be tolerated in the marketplace. So it's a time to put in a little bit more structure in how we come up with the concepts to meet the market needs. So that's a little bit about the process. And I want to give you kind of a timeout for a moment in disclaimer. Is this represents a day of work of people talking together and another day of building or part of a day. And so we're just going to show the part about how ideas are merged into concepts, but I'm not even going to try in 1 hour to show how we work on conflicting detailed design physics things. We're not going to get into how we compare concepts and weigh them out or anything like that. I'm just going to tell you you're going to see some things that might be new to you and some things you do all the time. I don't know, but we're going to show you how we put ideas together into concepts that meet the target. Okay, let's go. We're going to show you that in this case a team was given a challenge, and the challenge was that a company that had made a camper, this was in a workshop, said we want to create some more functionality and get some market differentiation, and we've got a specific camper model, and what we want to do is be able to store bicycles inside a camper. So this is the information they were given at the beginning is, let's try to make this happen. And some of the background marketing drivers of this were that it costs a lot of money to drive a second vehicle. Some people don't have a second driver. And sometimes, you know, for you engineers, you might come late to your camping trip and you might have to leave early because that's all you can do. So you really can't bring the bikes and you'd have to leave with the bikes. And I've done that. And often they want to actually come up with something the competition doesn't have. And if you've had one of these pop-out campers, there's tons of innovative things that fold out and pop out and double duty and connect on. So they're all about this kind of transformer type of thing. So this page is just naming the challenge that was dumped on the team that management wanted from their marketing pull. Okay. Now the mission is to come up with at least one concept that you can build, but come up with several concepts of a way to do this for a typical family in a mid-sized camper model. So now you're just loaded up on what the challenge is, and we want to build a prototype quickly, not take a year to do it or anything, and just try out the concept. So now we've got a picture of what the paradigm is that we've got to break, is that if you're taking a camper and you're taking kids, that second vehicle has to show up. And if we have a good innovation, it actually breaks a paradigm. And if you've ever seen something in the hardware store or something, you go, oh, that's innovative. There's probably a paradigm that you thought you could never have all that stuff in one tool or something, and it makes it lighter, smaller, or better, or faster. In this case, you wouldn't have to take a second vehicle. And there's some benefits to taking a second vehicle, yeah, and there's some benefits to not taking one. But in this case, we're trying to see if we can make that an option. Okay, so I'm going to stop for a minute and give you some education on what I call innovations. And innovations are a new combination of technical and organizational resources that increase the value-cost ratio. And so you may not have thought of innovations this way. You thought it had to be some kind of genetic thing or only nano stuff, but basically people put together things that existed already in a combination that could have been combined a lot earlier, but they've been combined exactly at this time in the market, and when you hit that sweet spot, then you've really got something that takes off. So if we get into saying, well, what is a value-cost ratio, it's basically something simple, says more of the things that are wanted and less of the things that aren't wanted. And so if that's as simple as it is, then the next step is to actually make sure the team that's innovating, that you clarify the things that are wanted and the things that aren't wanted. And if you've ever worked on anything with the team and you fail some of the prototype tests, you could say, hey, I didn't know that was a requirement, or I didn't know you didn't want that, or we didn't know what everybody wanted. So in order to get less iterations, one of the first successful steps is to be really clear about what the targets look like. And we're talking complexity is when you have many targets and constraints. So step one, we ask the team, we're going to define and understand step. We're asking them, hey, let's write on the wall and let's just argue it out. What are some of the functional requirements? And when we did that, some of the people in the room wanted to list the opposites because they had some training on that, and it really didn't matter. It was just to help them think. But basically the idea was transport the bikes, don't damage the bikes, don't damage the trailer, make sure the bikes never come loose when you go over railroad tracks and bumps, and everybody in the room could relate to this, and make it very easy to use so that the family could do it, the kids could do it. It didn't require lots of special tools, shouldn't cost a lot of money, and should hold about 5 bikes. So basically this is a starter list of if it was a successful innovation, it had to meet these functional requirements. So if we didn't meet all these requirements, it may not be something that would be called successful, but we're defining success. The second thing is to talk about constraints, and there are always constraints. So when we talk about what they were, and the team got these constraints given to them, I was facilitating, is it's got to cost less than $100 of new materials, that it can't block the kitchen, and we didn't know what that meant exactly, but can't block the kitchen, so we had to talk about it. It doesn't require the user to have great strength, and for those of you that do travel with bikes, you know that it takes a lot to lift bikes on top of a vehicle to be able to put them on, and some people can't do that. They may be too short or just not strong enough. For those of you that aren't strong enough, you know just what I'm talking about. To lift them all the way on top of an SUV is much different than all the way on top of a low-level car. Don't take too long. If you think about it, if you made some invention or innovation that took 40 minutes to load and unload bikes while everybody else would be gone, so we kind of talked about what that meant, and then we talked about that if you made something too specific, that as the children grew up and the bikes changed or they brought their friends, then we wouldn't be able to, it wouldn't work. So it kind of has to be flexible. And by the way, we can't damage things. That was written again. And when it's not being used, it needs to be out of the way. So as the facilitator, I said, well, we need to talk about this a little more and elaborate. So as we talked, we said, hey, why do you need to get in the kitchen? Well, it's because really we're trying to get, when you have little kids, you got to get to change diapers, get hot chocolate or milk chocolate. You got to be able to get, maybe you got a dog with you, got to get some food. Maybe you got to change clothes. Maybe you got to eat lunch and pull over. But that's a need that has to be not taken away by the invention. So that's a little bit of making sure we understand that we don't cause a new problem. Another one is making sure that, you know, the wife in this case can load the vehicle if dad isn't there, and that's been said, but we really want to make sure, and that's all about no heavy lifting required, no extreme strength. And then another thing is about the 20 minutes. That's the target we're going to shoot for, and then we need to be able to handle different size bikes. So as a facilitator, I was taking notes along the way because there's a lot of people might be writing and taking over, and this is just a copy of the notes page that I wrote down as I was thinking about it in my terms. What is it ideally? What kind of bikes would it be if it was my family? What would we do with it? What else could we do with it while it was not being used? For instance, I was thinking, well, if you had some way to do this inside the camper, maybe you could have a way to organize the bikes when you're already camping and they wouldn't be all laying over the campground. So I was just thinking about it personally, which helps to really absorb the challenge. So this is just how I was talking about what do you mean by hold the bikes? What do you really mean by no damage? We just make sure that everybody in the room is caught up, and that's quite different than some other structured or unstructured methods where people kind of learn the requirements as they brainstorm. This method of work for collaboration is that they would know really everybody in the room knows all the requirements before they start blurting out their ideas. And this is leaner because people don't end up blurting out things that are easily dismissed, because they can dismiss it in their own mind and says, well, the rules it can't cost more than 100. Why suggest something's going to cost 1,000? So this is just some of the dialogue. Now this step, it's on slide 26, is a slide that I get a lot of eye rolling, is where when I say we're going to do this, people kind of say, well, this is a waste of time and why are we doing it? And they call it pie in the sky. Is I just say, hey, we don't want to just make an invention that goes out on the market that's kind of good, and then as soon as it gets out there, another company makes one just a little better right away. So it's important not to accept like just a little bit of improvement. And the way to do that is stretch out and say, well, ideally, if we were going to have the very best invention possible, that would be a targeting method. It says, well, it would have to cost nothing. It would hold as many bikes as possible. There's no way you could have any damage, zero damage. It would be so easy the kids would load them and unload them, and you wouldn't need to keep track of any tools. And there's no way they'd ever come loose on their own. And when you're not using it, it's just gone. And so this kind of method is talking about ideality or ideally. And this serves to orient the team of where you're headed. And if you think about if you were walking with some people in this open field and you really had never announced where you're going, and maybe they just might follow the leader where he's going, but if everybody knew where you were trying to go, they might correct for mistakes because they all might see different clues. So we really are trying to give them some orientation. Without this clarity of what we're really headed for, even though we would never get there, you could end up not being lean, and your collaborative effort might be a lot of waste. So this serves, if you think about it, even though you set your compass for north, you never get north, but it's a good idea to have a compass, and it's a good idea to have a direction. So that's what this step is for, to stop and make sure people are calibrated in where you're trying to go. Because if not, a lot of the suggestions might be really in lots of different directions, and that's divergent, and it ends up taking a lot of time to sort all that out. So this actually is a step to make things leaner for your collaborative effort. Okay, so if we take it and put it all in one place, all the discussion that the team had, we would say, well, we're going to try to put it in one format on one thing on the wall to summarize. Is we want the bikes inside the camper, we want it easy to load and unload, we want them to not come loose, we want it easy to store the system when it's not in use, we want free access to the food and the rest stop use, and then we talk about things we don't want, and we don't want damage, we don't want special skills or tools, we don't want it to cost very much, we don't want it to be very heavy because that'll be more loss of mileage and weight, and things could go wrong that way. And we also don't want to have a lot of storage space taken up while you're actually camping, because that's another problem, is tripping over some kind of big frame thing. And we don't want to take too long to use it, and we want to be able to be adaptable. So this innovation ratio, again, is about what are the things you want to maximize and what are the things you want to minimize. And basically you're working to, we've defined this really well. We haven't invented anything up yet, but we have said, what do we want? And even when I'm inventing anything, I'll find that anytime I have to do rework is because I didn't clearly know what I wanted and some other things. But this is one of the ways to waste time, is not clarifying to the whole team what the goal is. And so this is a step to get this clarified on the wall in the team room and clear. And if someone doesn't understand or doesn't agree with it, you need to get that cleared up, because the work you're going to do later is possibly going to be wasted. Okay. Another step is to talk about conflicts. And some people call these engineering trade-offs, conflicts, crappy situations, whatever you want to call it. But just asking the team, are any of these things in conflict with each other? If we make it perfect, what would the challenges we would have? And the team immediately came up with 4 of them. And maybe you've already seen some of them. And I think as I've worked on this presentation, I've seen many more than 4. But these are the 4 we came up pretty quickly. Here's one. The more we put the bikes inside the camper, the more we're risking damage in the camper. That's just one. We've got to find a design that doesn't make that impossible. And that's a concern right away, is some people don't want the bikes in there. They're going to scratch up all the cosmetic surfaces. And here you go, putting bikes in there. So we've got to find something clever to do that. The second one is that by putting the bikes inside the camper, you're going to block that door, possibly. And then you'll have a new problem, is you can't pull over and just eat some cheap sandwiches. You'll have to go to a restaurant. Maybe it costs you more time. And if you've got small kids, they kind of want to eat certain foods. So it's a thing you can't mess with. The third conflict is if you have damage to the camper because bikes come loose, then your answer is going to be to go back and make things stronger, and that's going to make it more weight. By making something strong, you end up making it weigh more, and that's a traditional payoff or conflict you see all the time, and it happens. And the payoff is you can think of a clever way to do that. You get around this conflict. A fourth one is that easy to unload the bikes, you want to make it something easy to do, might conflict with how well the bikes stay connected or stay in place because you made it easy. So we've got to find a solution that gets around some of these, and I could go into 4 or 5 more, but this is enough to show you roughly what we discussed with the workshop. And the more of these you have, the harder it is to just think of it all at once. That's why it's good to have a group of people so they can tackle these challenges in a systematic, convergent way. Okay, so I want to put this in another format here for a moment and talk about if I take all the things we've learned and put them in one piece of paper where everything is stated kind of positively, and there's some methodologies that teach that, do not say it in a negative way. If we were to come up with the perfect answer to secure the bikes inside of a camper, all these boxes would be checked, because these are really paring it down. Sometimes things are restated in different ways, and you realize there's a constraint that's really just the opposite of a desire, and so sometimes the lists are a little bit redundant. So this is kind of a nutshell of when we get done with looking at some prototypes, we're going to come back and see if we hit all these on this shopping list. There's also some things that weren't musts, but they were things like, hey, maybe there's a way that when you're not using it, it could be stowed somewhere out of sight, so we're going to keep that in mind. But it's not a total requirement, but it would be nice. And also it wouldn't be ugly. That would be nice. And the third thing is I had put in there, hey, what about if we can use it as a rack maybe at home or on the campsite? That would have triple use, and that would be pretty innovative. So this sheet is, again, a summary of all the conversation and dialogue gone so far, and we haven't actually asked people to invent anything. We'll make sure they are clear about what the target looks like. When you think of a sniper, they really, really know what the target looks like. They don't waste a lot of bullets, but they do a lot of time approaching the target. All right, so I'd like to stop for a moment, and Walt's going to take over and take a poll. And the question is, do you want me to ask it, Walt? Oh, it's open already. The question is, do you ever, when you're inventing or innovating, do you actually call out the conflicting items before you start discussing solutions? And I think the poll's open right now. I'm not sure. I'd just like to see if it's you always do that, you sometimes do it, you never do it, or you're not sure.
Got 60% of people voted already, Harry. So
already? Well, how's it look?
2 seconds here.
That was quick.
It looks like we're going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. Okay, it looks like 63% say sometimes.
Sometimes, all right. Well, there's an area where you could say the more you can stop and think of those, the more you won't have do-overs, is what I'll tell you. That's what I find, and I still build things today and have do-overs, and I stop and say, what is it that I didn't think about, that if I thought about it, I wouldn't have to do this over, and I do that to try to hone my own skills. And it's easier to make mistakes by yourself, is what I find, because you can't always see what you're thinking. Okay, you ready to move on then?
Yep, let's go.
All right, thank you. Okay, now we're going to stop as part of the understand step and say, before you just go off and invent something, we're talking about reinventing the wheel. Let's just stop, and I ask teams to kind of look out on the net or to draw from their own experience or talk about what they've done at their own company, about what's already been done, and then we're going to talk about resource surveying. So first let's go into looking out there. So just as an example of a couple pictures, what are ways that people hold bikes just already? And some of these I took out on the road, and some of them I got from other places. But this picture of the bikes with the red frames on the upper left is holding the bikes kind of by the wheels and a little bit by the frame. The white bike on the lower left corner is being held by the seat and the handlebars. It's really opposite. The bike in the middle on the blue SUV is kind of partially disassembled and held by the wheels and I think by the forks. I'm not sure what this big piece of rubber is about, but it looks like it's to protect it. And then this bike on the right is on top of a camper, but it's a short camper. But it's held with part. So there's infinite number of pictures. I can tell you if you go to Google Images and you put in bike rack, you could never get done looking at all those pictures, and it's crazy stuff. But I can't put them all here. So this is a step where we might say, what are all the solutions in the past, and what are all the solutions within the company, outside the company? What are the kind of bikes that are going to be changing in the future? It's where we just kind of stop and say what's already been done and what is expected to be needed to be done in the future. And then looking at places they attach. So this step is, I'm not going to go further into it. So we're going to go into what I'll call resources, and we look in the context of the situation. If you think about it, before they build a building, the survey is done of the land, maybe what kind of rocks are in the ground, what kind of pipes and wires are already in the ground, how's the water run on the property, what buildings are nearby, what kind of access do you have. That's assessing the site resources. And then there's what kind of resources they can bring to the site to make the building they want. In this case, we're going to look at the resources that are in the system. In this case, the camper is the system. And we're going to start with just saying, if we're going to put these bikes in the camper, what are the things we can alter, what are the things we can touch, and what are the things we can't touch? And that's called looking at available and unavailable resources. So when we take a look at the camper as part of, we start with the biggest system first, and this is how the camper looks when it's, and these are my three sons, so we can get that out of the way. This is at a camping trip. I took a picture of my own camper and brought it to the workshop, and this is how it's used normally. So whatever system we come up with, it's got to be able to be used like this when we get to the campsite. And in fact, this section right here where their legs are is where a bed gets put in, and so all that has to be usable. We can't take away functionality. So this is kind of how it looks, but digging into resources is kind of peeling back. So when I go to the next slide, we're taking a plan view and looking at now to get around that conflict of space is what space should not be used is in the red, because you've got to be able to walk in the door and be able to come in through that space and get to the back. So if you block any of that, you've defeated the functionality you had before you started. So the space you have remaining, we kind of sketched on the word bike of spaces where you could put small bikes and big bikes and just kind of get the whole team. And there's a lot of measurements there taken of how big things are, how wide they are, how tall they are, and all that's just kind of surveying and getting to know. It's kind of a Gemba walk, you could say, is to get out there and look at the target model and see what's going on. Okay, so we've got available and unavailable space, and then we move on to taking a little bit closer look, and you'll see that this table, just looking, we aren't even inventing yet, this table is meant to fold up and sit on these rails, which implies if that's used for a bed, then it must be pretty strong, and that's giving us a hint or a clue that there's some underlying structure that's pretty strong, and that we'll use that later. It's just an idea that there's some things we could do. Now, if we take away all the fancy cushions, we start to see some uncosmetic surfaces that you could say those are surfaces we could scratch or drill holes in or screws, but we'd rather not. But we realize those things look like they have holes in them and they can be lifted up. But now we're starting to see some ideas come forth. We've got the space identified, and we've got some surfaces that are non-cosmetic. And when we really take a look at it, now we see lots of attachment points possible with the green arrows. And we see some space that we didn't know existed just by lifting up these covers, that maybe you can stow stuff or attach or put some structure that folds up and out, like a lot of bike racks collapse. So here's some space. Yes, there's some power wires in there, but a lot of this space you wouldn't normally know was there. So this is just identifying resources, and these things happen to all of us when we do home improvement projects or build things. As we're finishing the project, we notice stuff that if we thought about that, we could have done it slicker, but we're not really going to go back and do it over. Well, maybe at home it's okay to do it over, but at work, you've waited weeks for prototypes. You've got to wait for it's time to get them into your environmental testing and your verification, validation. So we can't have these, oh, by the way, I know how I do it better next time. It's because there's too much money and resources involved. Okay, now switching over to just looking at the bikes, just to stop for a moment and say, hey, what kind of things can we use for this invention? Not even knowing why we're going to invent it, and what things are off limits. Well, it's kind of obvious that you don't really want to grab greasy parts and flimsy parts like plastic water bottles. You don't want to grab onto the spokes. You don't want to run to scratch the painted surfaces if you're not going to protect them. But most bike racks that you can buy, a lot of them do grab painted surfaces, but they have some soft rubber protection as an interface. Now, looking at all the things available on the bikes, there are wheels, and a lot of bike racks touch the wheels or the frames or the rims or the forks, or the handlebars, or the seat. And you see that there's a lot of resources, even though they may not make sense right now. Air in the tires, the tubes, the pedals, the threaded holes in the pedals, the seat post. The bike structure itself is kind of strong. It's just not connecting to anything. And there's flexible joints. So we're just naming all the inventory. And if you've seen some survival shows, people do that. They make a list of all the things they have so they know what they have to work with. It's a long-held skill is to see what you have in your inventory. So we noticed that in this case somebody was clever on this bike. This is an intermediate temporary fixture that holds this bike on this rack because this particular kiddie bike doesn't have the kind of bar across the top that is needed. So this was an invention for sale to hold that kind of bike and hopefully not scratch it. So let's move on and look at some more resources. Racks. Well, in this case, there isn't a rack for sale, but what we're going to do is ask what kind of resources, because our strategy is we need to hold bikes securely, and we're not going to invent a whole new way to hold a bike. It's how to hold a bike in a camper. So our strategy was to look at all the kind of ways that bikes are held and make an inventory of that. And on the upper left, this is one that just holds it like you're holding out your hand on the frame. The one in the middle is holding it by the handlebars and the seat again. The one on the right is actually holding it just by the rims, upside down in a roof, in a garage. The one on the lower left is holding it by the forks with the wheel off. The one in the middle is a bike that was held by just taking a long bolt and putting some nuts on it, and it's kind of a custom, but it holds the bike just by making a bolt and some nuts and washers without buying anything. Here's an interesting twist, is that the bikes actually can be held to each other on any bike rack with a lot of bungees so they won't slam up against each other. And the one on the lower right is a common bike rack in the U.S. at least, it's grabbing onto the frame near the water bottle holder, and it's also grabbing onto the wheels. So these are just some of the common ways. There's got to be more, but I just want to get the idea that the intellectual resources of inventions already made can be a thing that you're not going to invent totally from scratch. You're going to leverage it. And some things you have to make new. But I said that invention was a new combination of existing resources to get higher value over cost. In this case, these are existing solution resources for just holding the bike. We don't know how to connect to the camper. Okay. One more thing is making a summary. This is a sheet we would put on the wall and say, okay, as you're thinking of ideas, don't forget, here's the resources that are available on the camper, in the bikes, in the racks, in the people, because we've got what kind of strength the people might have that they can hold, how can they adjust things and tighten things, and on the right side is things that are kind of hands-off. Now sometimes with solutions you have to break the paradigms or break what's unavailable, but first we're going to try to have an innovation with our collaborative effort that doesn't require us to go back and ask marketing, hey, maybe we need to touch the cosmetic surfaces, or maybe we need to make some special camper fixtures. Well, see if we can do it without asking for special favors. Okay, so this is kind of a summary sheet from the resource summary, which is part of Define and Understand. Now we're going to take another poll, and this poll is to say, does your team collect and clarify the current solutions within and external, like your competition, and the resources that are available and unavailable before you start creating new solutions? I'd like to know if you always do it. Boy, we all do it every time. Good for you if you do. I still find myself forgetting to do it, and it costs me. Sometimes, never, or you're not sure what I'm asking you. I'd just like to see how that one goes, because this is another habit. If you find that your answer isn't number 1 or number 2, you're missing some shortcuts, because these are ways to trigger that you would think of a better innovation the first time or the second time instead of the 15th time. Let me know when to keep going, Walt.
Okay, I gotta take myself off mute there.
Okay. Well, we're moving.
Okay, 70% voted already. That's a good. I don't know if you can see the results.
You wouldn't be able to see what the results were live, were you?
Yep, we got the results up on the screen now. I'm not sure if you can see that, but it's 14% always, 67% sometimes, 17% never, and 2% not sure.
Okay, well, I didn't know what to expect. Okay, all right. So thank you for doing the poll so quickly. It lets me be able to talk slower. So, all right. The next thing we're going to talk about is creating concepts, and we're going to get it a little more design engineer-like. And I want to introduce something that's just my opinion. Maybe no one will agree with you, but this is my own definitions about ideas and concepts. Now, officially to the world, they're synonyms. So they're the same meaning. These are Harry's meaning, okay? So you're going to work collaboratively with me. I think this makes things go smoother. So here's my definition. First of all, the way I see it, sometimes there's a need that's expressed, and to me that's like a hole in a puzzle that needs something to fit that specific one need. And humans that I've met often will say, I got an idea for how to fill that need. So then they start talking about that specific need, and they fill it. However, I think that ideas are often specific and singular and usually mentioned to answer a specific need, but not all the needs for the specific thing we're trying to make. The problem is that when people are being critical and responding back to the idea, they're responding from a different point of view. They may not be thinking about that need. They may not understand it's even part of the list. They may be thinking of their own idea to meet a different need. And so I think people are responding about, say, well, they're thinking about concepts, which are collections of ideas, like a whole puzzle. And so I look at it as if you think of all the needs that might come up in the functional list and the constraint list and everything, and you think there's a whole bunch of ideas that come up, then if you're comparing one idea to see if it meets all those needs, then the chance of a person thinking of an idea and a group of people saying, let's do it, is like 0. But if you thought about specific needs being met by specific ideas and you broke it down, and it's kind of anal, I know, but if you got a complex need with a lot of needs for a concept, you really can't just brainstorm out little ideas and expect to get much acceptance. So it really pains me, just like fishboning, when you really need to do structured problem solving, to see people trying to throw out ideas and getting them shot down. To me, it's just about total waste, unless it's a simple problem. So if I'm facilitating, this has got to be slowed down, and I've got a way to do it. But we've got to have people understand the difference between a whole puzzle of ideas put together. And I will say, no concept has them all fitting together very well, and they don't perfectly meet all the needs. But different concepts fill needs, and sometimes they leave a couple unfulfilled. Or sometimes they have puzzle pieces put in that don't fill any need, and that's waste. And that's why you really need to go and check off and say, what are all the needs, and what are all the answers? And this slide is kind of my money slide, because this is something that I think is important to understand and just have a distinction on, because I dare you to listen when people are kind of throwing out ideas and ask yourself, are they being evaluated as if it's a concept, or are they being evaluated for just the idea? So one of the ways we want to handle this group dynamics is that I'm going to ask people in this workshop not to just have a brainstorming session, but do individual thought and then group thought. And to me, blurting out ideas in a group, I've got it written here, creates the illusion of productivity. But that does more harm than good, because people are getting shot down left and right. Ideas aren't being captured. Needs might be mentioned, and it's just it's kind of chaotic. And we could have done it in a structured way, but unless we really announce we're doing a workshop, I know that's just how it's going to be. So if I'm leading the workshop, this is what I do. I said, hey, you've got all loaded up with all the constraints, the resources, the functional needs. Everybody's got them. They're on the wall. I want to just kind of go off on your own and create at least one concept. Some people make 5. Some people do work on little pieces. And I say, sketch out or write out whatever it is you've been dying to say, but don't tell anybody. Just write it out by yourself and get it out. And take 15 minutes or so. Sometimes I even turn on some calm music so people can kind of draw like they're in kindergarten. But make a sketch, make what's coming to mind, and I don't want people even looking at what everybody's doing. I want them to just do their own thing privately. And then we turn around and have dialogue about it and say, hey, let's talk about what everybody thought of, because if they were editing and getting all this feedback, people are going to tend not to share as much. So this kind of makes it safe for people to write out what they're thinking. And I've found this causes people, I don't even have to come up with good ideas. I just got to do this process. People will volunteer good ideas, and I can put them to work by matching them up. So I'm kind of an orchestrator rather than trying to be the genius that thinks of everything. It's actually a lot less stress to orchestrate than to have all the answers yourself. Okay, now I'm going to show you the beginning of thinking through concepts in detail, and I'm not really going to read all these words to you. What I want you to know is that here's just, for instance, an idea that's number 1, and people were sketching some ideas with bikes. And what we're trying to show you here is, I would like to ask you engineers on the phone not to worry about exactly what we're pointing out, but the group dynamics process is that we talked through idea number 1 for about 3 minutes, and the group responded to it. And I'm putting a little puzzle piece there because I'm trying to say that there was an idea that people said, we need to save that. That's pretty good. Bike rack clamps, just something about it. So I just want to show you an example that that was a little thing we're putting in inventory, and we're not going to throw everything else out, but we're just going to talk about the idea that clamps, and we're going to keep it for later, and we kind of made a mark next to it. As we had a collaborative dialogue, it was a person's ideas, they put them together in a concept, maybe they just showed a couple of ideas, and we moved on in just a few minutes. So switching over to the lower left-hand corner of this slide 48, we have concept number 1A, which might have been the same person. Sometimes I do that. And they were talking about maybe we could squeeze the tires like some of these bike racks. And we thought, well, the thing about that we liked is you didn't need a tool to clamp it or unclamp it. So we kind of put a puzzle piece next to that one. We might have done more, but I just want to show the idea of other people looking at the ideas. Rather than shooting them down, they're pointing out what's good or maybe not yet developed, but they're pointing out things that they might have grabbed and kind of in a quilt, put it together later. And I like to use puzzle pieces. So I'm going to move on to some more of these. Won't go into too much detail, but let's look at idea number 2. People thought about using a thing like the table and kind of making some cookie cutter slots. And we talked about, well, then the bikes have to be exactly that shape. But some of the idea that came out of it, of course, is using some of those strong pieces of the camper where that bed would lay down, and maybe that was a hint that we could use that and tie things down with bungees and the bikes would be all together. The table might store under it. But this was just an exploration somebody had about how to copy the bed that falls in place, but used it for bikes. So we moved on to idea 2A, and someone said, hey, why don't we hang the bikes from the top of the camper, and then they'll just swing and stuff. Maybe we can hold them down with some bungees and suction cups. And they thought of, well, maybe we don't want to damage the top of the camper. Maybe we discussed it. Maybe we'll make kind of a triangle teepee thing and hang them. But part of this idea was we have to find some way to connect to the camper. And this one would cause some holes to be drilled, and the other one might scratch it. But we just accept the concept. People talked about it, maybe made marks of what things they were worried about or not worried about. And then on idea number 3, I can't read all of it, but there was a couple ideas gotten out of this that the team marked. I'm going to move on to number 4. Somebody talked about squeezing a whole bunch of bike tires with some 2x4s and wood and bringing some stuff to it to hold the frames tightly and make it easy to move in the open space. 4B was a pretty wild idea. They said, why don't you just get a whole bunch of beanbag chairs, put the bikes in, and they'll just move around, but they'll never touch anything. Kind of keep them just suspended in space. Maybe they could be inflatable. And then there was the idea on 4C, which really struck me because I didn't come up with it, is remove the bicycle seats and then insert in there a wooden 2x4 with holes drilled in it, and then put the seats back. So the seats actually became some of the clamping mechanism and held the bike space. So I just thought this was, I'll say, ingenious, clever, or brilliant, but I just really liked the insight someone had to remove the seats and use the fact that they could be clamped back down and have only just bring this board to the party. I mean, it's so minimal. I'm always excited when I see someone think of something that I didn't think of, and it's just ingenious because it's so elegant. Okay, I'm going to move on to another picture, and this is where we're starting to have much more complex things show up on the screen because people are starting to borrow from each other because they're in the room, and they'll say, hey, I'll borrow a piece of your idea. And what we see if we have this safe environment is that people go away from having their own idea that they're competing to start to see what I'll call a super idea or a we idea. People are starting to have ideas that are more complex, but they're using things that they know the group thinks is good. Number 5, someone thought about hanging the bikes from the table with some kind of straps or slings and then only suspending the handlebars. And they've got a side view here. Another one, number 7, was talking about, I think, using some of the structure again that's available and still using just part of the tires in the slots. That way it wouldn't matter how long they were, but connecting, the puzzle piece here is for connecting to the side of the camper and maybe using some pads between the bikes. Number 6 on the lower left-hand corner was about snapping in, but still people mentioned about a clamp and connecting onto the wood. And that keeps coming up as you see people are starting to home in on things. And number 9 is really complex, but they were talking about the bikes getting stacked together and maybe they're standing straight up. I won't get into all of it, but we're still collecting puzzle pieces to try to meet needs. And that's what everybody seems to be capable of doing, is coming up with a couple of things to meet needs, but no one person without a whole bunch of thought by themselves can come up with it all. And once you see that 4 or 5 people together are really pretty smart at seeing all the angles, it's really leaner to work together collaboratively as a team than it is to try to have one lone genius thinking of it all. And because there's less time frames available, there's more market risk, we really can't afford to rely on one person. And what if they're on vacation and you don't get anything? Now, idea number 8 I put off to the side because this one on slide 51 is something about hiding a whole bunch of structure down in the hidden space and having it kind of pop up and connect onto the bikes. And it seemed kind of overkill and everything, but in the way of talking about it, we kind of harvested some things about clamping and the fact that the bikes are not all the same size, which actually is a resource, because if we had to put bikes that were exactly the same size, it would be actually harder than if you had bikes that couldn't nest because they aren't the same height and length. So we got some of that out of it, and we also thought of the idea here, number 6 on this page, was that maybe a bike could be trapped just between the other bikes, like we saw was a method, and that might be working out. So on this, what was kind of a crazy idea of having this whole structure pop up and hide, we get out of the idea that maybe we can rotate the forks and use that as a resource. We can use C-clamps to hold them. We can use this thing that holds the bikes. It's called a fork clamp, I guess, that doesn't need any tools to hold the bikes. Now, it does mean that the wheels will have to be put somewhere, but it makes the bikes lighter, too, because now it's easier for a person to lift a bike into the camper because it has a heavy object off the front, and you can kind of use the handlebars to put it in. So when you get, just because someone talked through a crazy concept, this is kind of a different way than managing brainstorming. We talked about the fact that we need a long rail, but where are we going to stow this thing, and how's it going to come apart, and how much tools you would need. But I wanted to make the point that it could be a crazy idea where some basic realizations like this middle picture, that the handlebars can miss each other by just an inch, and it compacts the space needed. All right, so I'm going to go forward, and we're going to talk about refining a little more and start to have our inventory. And if you look at it, we said, how are we going to hold the bikes? Well, we kind of made the decision we're going to use these kind of clamps because they're already proven concept. How are we going to connect to an intermediate structure? We're going to use a steel rail instead of a wood, so it takes up less space and it won't need so much support cross pieces. There's some pluses and minuses. It might weigh more. It might scratch things. We're going to use some C-clamps. We're going to connect onto the strong part of the wood that won't matter if we scratch it a little bit. And to protect the bikes from touching the camper, when we keep them there, we're going to put some just tarps down so that you don't bring in the dirt, and it won't matter so much if we drop something or whatever while we're putting them in. And we're going to keep them suspended in the middle of the camper without touching anything. So this is just some of the needs being met in an inventory, but without thinking about the whole thing. We're making sure we meet the individual listed items. Okay. And now here's some more of them. How are we going to keep the bikes from touching each other? We can put towels, we can put swimming trunks, we can put these noodles, you can put inflatable stuff, you can put the bike helmets or the wheels. Some people talked about using the rubber of the wheels as spacers if you turn the wheels sideways. We also talked about where we could store this, and we thought, well, if we could make it small enough, we could store it somewhere with the bikes, or store them underneath this hidden area. So we're starting to get ideas, and this is quite a different way than people shouting over each other about which concept is better. We're working at the idea level and the need level. Bungeeing the bikes together keeps them from moving. Having a little piece of some plastic on the end of the steel keeps it from being a sharp edge. We have to make a custom mount for a bike that has a different size fork because it won't fit in the special thing, but since we saw there was a way to do it with a bolt, we got that covered. As we go along, we had a specific dialogue on, okay, we're going to use, on slide 55, we're going to use these fork mount devices with clamps, but see how it takes 5 of them we're going to get rid of one of those because when we really did the measurements, there isn't enough room, and we're going to trap a bike. But one of these things came out of there and says, how can we get rid of all this support structure? Well, we're actually duplicating structure that already exists. So the big winner on this sheet is that in this green area, the idea was just to have a rail by itself. And some of you may have already thought of all this, but what I say is if you can't handle these simple problems and work through it this way, you can't handle the 1,200 functional requirement problems. And I know some of you in the audience have worked on things with hundreds of requirements and constraints, and you can't just brainstorm those out. You've got to work them out like a financial audit. You've got to work all of them out. So in this case, we got some questions. Can we nest the bikes close together so they take up less space? Can we take advantage of the fact that the bikes are not identical? Yes. Can we use the fork clamps to hold them and make sure that they're kind of out of the way, how we mount them so the handlebars will miss each other? And can we eliminate the braces? So just from talking about idea 10, which came later in the process, we're actually starting to come up with some pretty lean things that will hold the bikes. But this part in the green was a key moment where we realized we could make it very elegant. Okay. Now, normally in a workshop, I want to make sure you know that we wouldn't want to force ourselves to only build one prototype and only have one concept. But for the sake of time, I'm going to show you how we went through and finished off on one of them, because it's another whole skill set to compare and evaluate concepts. Okay, selecting and trying out. All right, so doing an audit of the needs, and I'm actually using the little symbol here on slide 58 of what were the puzzle holes that had to be filled, and I just showed you that we actually, if we audit, we have filled every one of those needs with something specific that we're going to do as a design team, working collaboratively. It wasn't just one person's idea. And if this goes well, the ideas no longer have a thing like this is Judd's idea or this is Mike's idea. We actually have it where it's just the idea and it's the concept, and people have collaborated so much that it really doesn't matter anymore. Now, if we go with some of the things that were nice to have, we got a couple of those, but one we really aren't going to meet is we don't have a way to make the bike rack work anymore outside the camper because we took away all the structure. Because we're borrowing structure from the camper with the clamps and the wood, it really won't work outside unless it happened to clamp to a picnic table, but who would want to take their wheels off? So our main focus is met, but not some of the side things. So if we go ahead and start looking at the puzzle pieces, you could see that I just showed you all these little snapshots of things that were picked out from our work. And this is kind of our inventory trying to be coalesced into one concept. And then we go down to this is the actual build. It's almost nothing is what I would say. 4 bikes would actually be held. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 clamps that actually ended up being pink that we bought. And they'll never get confused with any other clamps around. And we did actually need 1 tool and some pliers to be able to tighten these down. And no holes were drilled in the camper at all, and only one end of the rail had to be cut so that we could make this specific special piece, and the other end was just fine. And the big feature was that the pink clamps were actually, I think, a little cheaper because nobody was going to buy them, and they're just about the right size and they're easy to identify. So if we go on and look at how this final solution, the first prototype, looks, when it's installed in place, it's just held like in space with 2 clamps. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 bikes are held, and there's a little more space here. Instead of buying another $28 fork clamp, the bike just gets trapped with the other bikes because there's a little space to stagger it. And the whole thing's about as big as a large umbrella. So a good, elegant innovation has all the things you want. We need that, we need that, we need that, but we really didn't need the rest of it. And if we didn't take it out, some other competitor would take those things out. And that's important to trim things down and try to make it harder for someone to take away your business after you invest in this innovation. If we look at some of the details, this is exactly how we found we could clamp. There's some really strong hardwood right in this part of the frame, and it doesn't matter if you scratch it, and we're really not having much scratch going on, and you don't need tools to tighten it. On the end, we just took a piece of scrap pipe and put it on the end just to keep from being a sharp edge, and it actually stayed on its own, which I think was interesting, no glue. If we go a little further and look at how the bikes look from the top, they're staggered. They are lighter because the wheels are off. It's easy to move the bike into the camper. These bikes are not touching the camper anywhere where they could lead to a scratch. They're actually touching things that are foamy or whatever, like those handlebars. And it's actually an advantage that the bikes are non-uniform. So really looking at what your actual situation is and to keep thinking about the flexibility is important, how things will change, and we just had to really buy this one log rail. If we look at how it looks when it's fully implemented on slide 64, the bikes are in place, you can walk in the door, and you look at it from the area where you're standing inside looking from the refrigerator end. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bikes with their wheels and the helmets, and there's still room. We could actually put another bike or two in, and it's done. And we've just put some of the floor mats that would normally be outside at the campsite are there just to keep things from touching while we're driving, and there's bungees. So I would say, here's one quote from there, is it was very satisfying to build it and have very few surprises, and even those were minor, and it was easy to make the whole thing, and it was done the first time. Looking at how it stores, which was one of our wants, it actually goes away in the space that was not being used for anything. You can hide it, and actually some of the shape of this yellow thing here actually kept it in place without using any clamps because it was just a little bit of interference. If we look at that, that's the finished item. I'm going to go back for a second and say, could you believe we would end up something was almost nothing on slide 61? It really did cost less than $100. There were many more ways we could have talked about doing it. This is one of them. So I want to switch now. We're done showing you the workshop, and I want to give you some homework. You've just seen something that maybe you could have made by yourself, and I'll tell you the only way to get good at this is to practice, practice, practice. So I would challenge you now, it looks like there's 92 people on this webinar, I believe, and to say how many of you will risk taking some time and identify a situation that you currently are dealing with in the month of And then I'd like to challenge you to give me feedback. Maybe you wait till April or send me an email and say, hey, I tried those questions. I didn't really understand what some of them meant, or I want to talk about what happened, because I'd like to know how it works for you. And I've used it in a lot of situations, a lot of variety of things. What I'd like to know is get back with me on email and let me know how it worked for you as a guest on our ASQ webinar. Here's now coming up is the actual slide. These are questions that I actually went through for the define and understand step only. So if you take this page and print it, my email is on the bottom of this page. This is a standalone sheet, and you can see how it works for you. I can tell you when I first started doing it, I was baffled. It just looked easy, but it wasn't. But you'll get it if you keep trying. Okay, I've actually included some examples of some actual engineering things that had to be done that I'm not giving you the answers, I'm giving you the challenge. So if you wanted to say, you know, how does this relate to real life stuff, these are just measurement challenges. And if you're a problem solver and you're successful at it, you probably had to invent measurement systems a lot to be able to quantify things and do your quantity science tools. So this is just an example of some things that I've been involved in where we had to create a measurement system kind of ad hoc out of junk, and we had to make it work. And we didn't have an R&D department do it, we just had to invent it, and we used these techniques to come up with it. On the next page is some examples of some design concept challenges of how some things worked that I was involved with or I've seen, and these can be done, they're all doable, and they were done by having some paradigm shifts, taking advantage of existing resources, and breaking some paradigms with some new elegant ways of doing things with even less than there was before. So, in summary, for this webinar number 2 from me is I'm saying that structured concept development is useful in some situations where people are willing to go through and be led through a process, that it's very important in this process to absorb all of the requirements, the constraints, and the resources early. The more you audit and look around and see what's available for you to pick up and use to build something, the more elegant and less time, less rework, less afterthought and regrets because you thought about what was available and you made sure with your management what kind of money you could spend, what kind of time was available, and make sure you think about time, resources. I mean, there's the old adage about do you want it fast, cheap, or good. You need to find out what meets this situation. It's important to leverage the variety or the diversity of the individuals on the team one of the things I'm seeing over and over again is you can't let just the alpha person in the room dominate the conversation, because no one person seems to know enough anymore to really handle a complex situation. And some companies actually prevent those people from being in the room because they'll shut down everybody else, and that's part of their success strategy, is get them out of the room because they won't allow everyone else the safety to talk. The facilitator you have just can't be just any old facilitator, because they need to know what questions to ask, when it's time to move on, and if the team is stuck in a technical detail, they have some of the tools on how to unstick them by asking the questions rather than having the answers. And it's important to document the ideas and the concepts that are brought up, because sometimes an important idea is brought up as part of a silly kind of concept that can be used later, maybe even years later, but it was a concept that was ahead of its time. So a lot of good methodologies say if you aren't documenting what's going on, you're leaving a lot on the table, you're throwing a lot away. So this is my talk I've wanted to give for a long time to kind of show people through. It's very seldom that you can show people how you invent things, because it's usually intellectual property of a company. So by doing this bike workshop, we were able to have some things that for training a group of people, we were actually training them how to do the dialogue, which was the main point of having the group together, and I had to give them a challenge. So I'd like to give you a few things to study if you wanted to. I found a video online about introverts and how their thoughts are important and how we need to work with them. I just found this on TED Talks. In my opinion, is if you're not watching TED Talks, you're really missing a big resource in these days online. The second thing is these two I put on my last webinar, The Importance of Concepts and Creativity Improvement. That's an article that's in Quality Progress Magazine. If you're an ASQ member, you've got this already in your archives, or you can get to it. Another Quality Progress Magazine article is Creativity Improvement. It's by Lloyd Provost and R.M. Sproul, but I think it's a good article also. And then here's one of my favorite books to learn some of these paradigm breaking, and Suddenly the Inventor Appeared. So that's a book you can buy. It's a quick read, but I would recommend you just get one and take a look at it. You can actually go through about 44 problems that will stretch your mind. Okay, we're at the question and answer period. I kind of whizzed through this pretty quick, so I'd like to know if there's anything you want to ask about, and we'll turn this over to Walt, and we can see what we want to dialogue about. So turn it over to you, Walt.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Harry. Very good webinar. Very enjoyed it. Folks, if you want to ask Harry a question, please enter your question into the questions dialogue box here on the right.
Walt, do you want me to go into one of those while they're writing?
While they queue that up, let me review one. Well, why don't you go ahead? Why don't you go ahead, Harry? And then I'll finish up. We'll have an announcement at the end. We'll announce the next webinar before we break free here.
Okay. Let me know what you want. I'm ready to go.
Okay, go ahead with your questions that came in already.
Okay. Walt told me that he had some questions coming in already, and one of them is, could this be used for the supplier, I think it was supplier excellence? And could it be used for supplier excellence to develop? And I would say if anywhere, for that person that wrote that question out, anywhere you don't have a concept for doing something that you're happy with, you don't like it, it's got things that aren't being satisfied, constraints, it's too costly, it's going to take too long. If you're not happy with the concept and it's pretty complex, it's not easy, then you need to get people together, and instead of brainstorming or just watching the clock go by or hiring somebody else to do it, if it's complex, you need diversity of thought, then managing the dialogue with the facilitator is the way to go. So I really wouldn't say what arena, because I've done this in hospitals, I've done it in military defense situations, real estate situations, transportation, aerospace. It's people, and people talk and come up with ideas all the time. So I really wouldn't say when you couldn't use it. I would say you don't use it when it's a simple thing. That's overkill. And I've got another question, Walt, if you want me to go into it, but I'll wait a second, see what you got coming in.
Yeah, we got some coming in. Go ahead and finish your train of thought there.
Oh, I'm done with that one. Another question says, what do we do with failed prototypes? Can we use the process for that? If I was talking to you about this situation, I would say, if the prototypes failed, in what way did they fail? What kind of test did they fail? Whatever it was they failed, was this clarified that it had to be able to meet this requirement in the beginning? Or was it a surprise to the team that came up with the prototype design? Was the test that was run a reasonable test for that requirement? Maybe it was overkill on the test, but it was the right requirement, and the team didn't forget it, but they did it too much. Some people call that making a hard-boiled egg, but I would use that in this context as over-testing the prototype. Another thing is maybe the prototype, maybe the design was right, it was understood what was needed to be done, the test was right, but the prototype parts weren't built to the right dimensions, maybe they weren't built out of the right material, maybe they weren't assembled right. There's a lot of ways to fail at this, but if you're having prototypes fail, something didn't happen right. It's either communication, design, or fabrication and assembly. So that's one of the other questions that was brought in is go back and do your failure analysis on the prototype work.
Okay, great. I've got one question I can answer here from Ryan. Is it possible to get a copy of this presentation via email? Ryan, we already have these slides posted to our website, so it's even easier. So just please go to our website and download that. That file's already there. Harry, one for you. Francisco asked, when looking at other solutions out there, how do you handle patents and trademarks?
Well, it's okay to look at things, and it's okay to see the current stuff, because one is you need to look to see if you're doing something, even though if you thought of it, it still might be owned by somebody. And if you look at things, you can see what is owned. You might decide that your company wants to use that particular idea, and they'll be happy maybe to sell that to you. But it's good to be aware of what is the current solutions. And sometimes I assumed that somebody's already thought of something, and I looked and looked, and I finally realized, geez, I guess I invented something. No one's even doing this yet, and it seems obvious. So you want to know if it hasn't been done, if it has been done, but you need to be aware of that, because you're either overdoing it or underdoing it. But it's easier now for us in this generation to search the U.S. Patent Trademark Office, uspto.gov website than ever, and it's easier for you to search things and look at images than ever. It used to be possible for people to invent things in the world at the same time and not know it. It's harder for that to happen now because of the speed of communication and availability. But getting around them, that's another other topic. You can you need to know what's out there first, and then you can plan your path.
Great. And then a follow-up question from Francisco. Are there any professional certifications for these practices?
There's professional facilitator certifications on how to handle group dynamics by itself. What I'm doing is a mixture of about 6 different things I've learned from different people, in different times. But no matter who does this, you're always a product of your past. But there's one thing to know the techniques, and it's one thing to be able to handle the group and have the experience. So I could name lots of things that are pieces of it, but I'm not going to. There's no one thing to go and get, and I'm turning out to say that I just don't see people getting to the training business on this. I think there's people that will take your money, but I don't see people deciding to make certificates for this. There are some. And you'll learn something from them if you do it, but I don't want to plug them today. That's what I'll say.
Okay.
I've been to some of them.
Yeah. Okay, another one from Garrett. I want to be able to share this with colleagues who missed this tonight. Is there a non-copyright version of the video? And I guess I'll answer that. We're going to post this to the ASQ website, but you have to be an ASQ Automotive Division member to download it. And then if you want to download it and share it with your colleagues, that's your prerogative. So that's how I'm going to answer that one.